Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our guest today is Dr. Heidi L.M. Jacobs. Heidi L.M. Jacobs was born and raised in Edmonton. A graduate of the University of Alberta, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Western University, she is currently a librarian at the University of Windsor, as well as an award-winning writer and documentary producer. Her previous books include the novel Molly of the Mall, Literary Lass, and Purveyor of Fine Footwear, New West Press 2019, which won the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humour in 2020, and 100 Miles of Baseball, 50 Games, One Summer, written with Dale Jacobs, Biblioasis 2021. She is one of the researchers behind the award-winning Breaking the Color Barrier, Wilfred Boomer Harding, and the Chatham Coloured All-Stars project. Heidi's new book, published by Biblioasis, is 1934, The Chatham Coloured All-Stars Barrier-Breaking Year. Those of you who are regular listeners may know that this is Heidi's fourth time on the podcast. Welcome back, Heidi L.M. Jacobs.
Thank you for having me. I had no idea it was the fourth time. Wow.
It is. I know it's all a blur. So, memorably, the very first time you were with us on the podcast, when you were just bringing out Molly of the Mall, we were delighted to discover that you were using a 1980s era ATM receipt as a bookmark. What are you using as bookmarks nowadays?
What am I using a bookmark? I have, actually, funny you should mention that. In my bookmark for this book, which I would read today, I've got, I don't know if you can see it, it's like a little tiny page. And this was a page from the June chapter of this book. And so I've come a ways from my, I don't know, I had $30 or 23. So, but I found this and I had a whole stack of them, and unfortunately I can't see them, but I was having a really difficult time writing June 1934 chapter. And so I printed off these little tiny pages and then I rearranged them on my desk in a better order and moved stuff around. And it worked really well. So partially, I think I had it in here as a bookmark because I don't know, it's a nice memory to like remember that even the worst, messiest, most horrible chapters and that never seem to work will somehow end up as an actual book. So I think maybe that's I guess like my ATM receipt from the 80s. It's a reminder of where we have come and where we're going. And so, but thank you. That is a great question. I forgot about that ATM receipt. Yep.
Yes. Congratulations on having like $230 in your account now.
Yeah, exactly. It's good. It's much better than the 28 or whatever it was that I had before.
That's really an interesting process about your writing. So you literally moved pages around and you printed them off. Do you often structure your books literally? Do you take printouts and do you put them up against a wall or Post-it notes? Are you one of those writers, or did you just have to do it with this work?
I'll pause and walk over and grab. I'm sure this is an audio thing, so people can't see it, but I'm holding up a pink box, and this box is full of index cards on elastics, and this is the very first version of the book. So it started off as index cards because there was so much information that I had, and I couldn't imagine how it was all going to come together. So I just wrote, key points and dates and whatever, and then I shuffled them around. So this. Yeah, I tend to do actually a lot of physical shifting around. I like when I'm stuck, I will work with a pen, and I do find just that tangible physical act of moving pages around, especially on a long document, because it's hard to see once you move, page 130 to 260, all of that. It's difficult. So I do like that really tangible thing. So when I'm stuck on something, I usually go to the physical, the analog the pen, the pencil. I even cut, actually the introduction was physically cut into paragraphs, and then I taped it together and then I rebuilt it that way. So yeah.
Yeah. Did you learn that from other writers? There particular writers who influenced you in method or in types of writing that you can think of?
Well, we were at the University of Nebraska trained to be writing teachers. And so these are things that I would teach my students sometimes. It's just moving stuff around and cutting it up and, glossing it and figuring out what paragraphs should go where. So yeah, it was a useful trick to teach, and then actually have in my little bag of tricks to get myself out of any writing problem that I ran into.
But this sounds a little bit like your crochet practice as well, Heidi. Do you think that there are any connections there?
Yeah, no, and actually one of the things that I really like to do is when I'm writing, I often have a jigsaw puzzle going at the same time. And so when I started doing the really, really big revision, I was going to say renovation, but kind of was a renovation of the 1934 draft, my brother for Christmas had got me a 3,000 piece Snoopy puzzle that took up my entire dining room table. And it was really meditative and useful because with both the book in the revision process and my puzzle, there'd be points where I like, none of this is ever going to work. It is never going to work. At least to the puzzle, you know that probably all 3,000 pieces have a place and they're probably all there. But it was a, sort of an act of faith. And I actually finished the puzzle right around the same time as I finished the first big revision of this. So yeah, I do like, so that might be a good metaphor to that sort of sense. And then you think this is never, ever, ever, ever going to come together. And then suddenly you find a couple little pieces and a couple little things that you had upside down or were in the wrong place. And then suddenly, oh, a lot of things. But yeah, just dogged keeping at it.
2 of your books are now about baseball. How did you first become a fan, and what is it that you still love about it?
Well, it's funny because I think if people have known me a long time, probably before maybe I moved here, they would find this very unusual that I have 2 books about baseball. I think Molly of them all is much more within what people know and expect of me. But actually, the first time I met my husband, Dale, we had a group project together and we went for a beer after, and he'd just been to Chicago and he was talking about seeing the Cubs, and I said, oh, are they the team that have all the ivy on their stadium? That's how little I knew about baseball. And so slowly over time he took me to my first major league game, and then we moved here, and I really fell for the Tigers. I really, really enjoyed them. And so we ended up getting season tickets, and it became such a big part of our lives. And then the Harding Project, which is what we used to call the All-Stars Project, sort of fell in my lap by a whole bunch of coincidences. And it just really hit a bunch of points in my life. I'm really interested in stories that need to be told. I have a lot of my doctoral research was on 19th century women's voices who'd been lost over time, women of color who'd been left out of the telling of history. And so when I heard about this team, I thought, wow, this just checks all sorts of boxes of things that I'm really interested in: local history, an amazing story, sports, history that should be known but isn't. And so the All-Stars really sort of have taken over my life in all the best ways. And then the 1930 or the 100 Miles Project just sort of, again, we were sort of in a rut with our baseball watching, and Dale and I were trying to figure out how to figure out why we were sort of disconnected from the Tigers. And then we realized it may not have been baseball that we were not, connecting with. It was sort of the big stadium major league stuff. And so we found all sorts of lovely little places to see baseball and new. So I'm on actually Friday on the 26th, I think I'm going to my first Tigers game since the pandemic. So, it's coming full circle, and So that's pretty exciting. But I think, and your question, Kim, originally was, what is it that is what I like about it? And I think one of the things I really like about it is the amount of failure in every game is just remarkable. Like, a really good batting average is, let's say 300, 350, which means, out of all the pitches that they get thrown, they fail whatever, the way more than they achieve. And I think that's always been a really good thing to think about with writing is you will probably fail at more things than you succeed at with writing, but you just have to keep stepping up the plate and keep swinging, and eventually your pitch is going to come and it sails out of the park. So I think that's one of the things I really like about it is just, you never know when the perfect pitch is going to come, but you just have to be standing at the plate, waiting for it and being ready for it, and believing that pitch will come. So it's a nice metaphor for writing.
Yeah. Baseball is a sport with a lot of humility built in. Yeah, it's true.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of time to think too, right? Like, I think that's why a lot of writers glom onto baseball as a sport. It's a contemplative game, for sure.
Wow, the metaphors are so strong in this interview. You've now written 3 very different books: a satirical rom-com novel, a work of nonfiction based on your experience as a baseball spectator, and now this exploration of the history of a trailblazing Black baseball team. How does your writing routine differ when you're working on this kind of book as opposed to other projects you've undertaken?
Yeah. And then I've also written tons of scholarly stuff too. So they're all different hats. My colleague in English, Nicole Marcotic, always says every time she starts a new writing project, she has to teach herself how to write again. And I always think when she said that, I thought, oh, that is really great, because I think sometimes we all think, oh, well, I finished this, I should just go from, instead of starting at A, you could just start at, L or M and you're on your way. But you do have to start at the very beginning every time. And it is, I think that's a great question, Irene, about they are very different things. And, with fiction, the exciting and the challenging thing is you can make anything up, right? You can make anything work if you want to. Creative nonfiction, so the 100 Miles of Baseball, you can leave stuff out if it doesn't quite fit. You're like, oh, I'll just leave it out. When you're writing history and sort of this one's very much rooted in the scholarly tradition, you can't leave stuff out. Like, if you can't find something, you can't say, oh, well, I'll just skip that. You have to either find it or explain why you can't find it or imagine what's there. So all of them have these great opportunities. When I was writing this one, I know exactly what happens in 1935. Writing a novel, who knows what happened? And actually, I realized all 3 of my books are about a year or a season. I mean, this is 34 has a little bit before and after, and 100 Miles is a baseball season, and Molly of the Mall is also a year. And so with 1934, the one thing I did know is I knew exactly how their season ended. And so that's the exciting part and the challenge, I think, to make all that work. So it's been fun to really stretch myself as a writer and try new things. There's lots of things that I was drawing on in 1934 from my scholarly background. There's stuff from my creative nonfiction background. And then there was also some stuff, even though this book isn't a work of fiction, I did want to tell a story, and I did want to sort of have readers imagine what it was like to be there. And so I drew on a little bit of that kind of scene setting and structuring, and paying attention to pacing was huge too, I think. And so one of the things I always read for, in the same way one would read a novel manuscript, is how the pacing is like, okay, well, this is dragging, so how do I break that up so there's a bit more momentum? And so it was fun to sort of draw on all parts of that background.
So you did touch on what drew you to the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. But how did you come across them? How did you come across that story? And what was that spark like for you?
I often tell this story about I was on a plane going to a conference. It was, I think, in 2015 or 16, and I got a email from my colleague in history, Miriam Wright, and she said, "Oh, I just met this woman at this event, and her father-in-law was part of the first Black baseball team in 1934 to win a provincial championship. He was also a hockey player. He was also an athlete and all sorts of stuff, the first Black postman." And she said, "It's a really interesting story, and they have 3 scrapbooks. Do you think the library and your Center for Digital Scholarship would be interested in helping her and us make a website for this project?" And I remember it was that time where I was getting the, "Ma'am, please put your phone away. Please put your phone away," because we were just taking off. And so I just wrote back, "Yes, yes, yes, yes." And then I spent the whole plane ride just thinking how exciting that was. And so, I mean, it was sort of love at first sight when I heard about the project. And then I met the Hardings, and they were lovely, lovely people. And I saw the scrapbooks, and I was thinking like 3 scrapbooks, like I was thinking this much, but like each scrapbook is this big. So there's like, 2.5 feet of information, and it was meticulously researched. And I mean, the story was there, and there's way, way, way more that we could talk about with Boomer Harding for sure. But even, 1934, there's lots to talk about. So, yeah, it really was. I've been saying a lot to people. I don't know what I'm going to do without these guys living in my head. I'm going to miss them. I feel like I have got to know their descendants, and I've got to know the men who made up the team well by looking at their box scores, hearing their interviews, reading what they have to say over and over and over again. And I do have to remind myself I have never met these men, but they are alive in my head. And I am going to miss them. I really am going to miss them very much.
Can you just expand a little bit more about the other projects that you've been telling this story?
Sure. So the original project that that Miriam Wright and my colleague Dave Johnston at the library sort of spearheaded at the University of Windsor alongside the Chatham Kent, the Chatham Sports Hall of Fame and the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society and the Harding family. So we all worked together, and we put in a Trillium grant to create a website called Breaking the Color Barrier, which Irene mentioned at the beginning. And at first we thought we would just sort of digitize these scrapbooks, and we laugh about this now, but we thought we would be done in August, so 4 months after we got this. And now, like, I don't even know, what is this, 7 years later, we're still working on this. But so we digitized the entire scrapbooks, and within that we did see this really lovely story, again, that nice arc about the 1934 season. So we focused our website on 1934, but also bringing in some other things. We also realized in talking to Blake and Pat Harding that they always said, this is just the tip of the iceberg on the story. There's so much more here. There's so much more to talk about. She said, you need to talk to all the families. And so we launched a pretty large scale oral history project. We interviewed as many descendants of the families as we could. I think we have about, it was like 17 interviews. And we went through and we found more newspaper articles, and we did a lot more research. And so our website is quite a rich resource. We've got K-12 curriculum that Chantel Browning-Morgan did a beautiful, beautiful job of tying the All-Stars into the Ontario curriculum from, I think it's grade 1 to 12. And we're really proud of that. So there's the website, but we also had a whole bunch of other components to it. We created a series of traveling banners that went to schools and museums and galleries and a whole bunch of places. And so those were around. We did a set of baseball cards that we were just at first just going to make them as little graphics. But then we realized it was kind of fun and people really liked them. So we printed off these really cool little baseball cards and used them as a fundraiser for the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society. And eventually we did a little mini comic with a different grant that Scott Chandler did a little comic, and we were able to, through our grant, give several thousand copies to local school kids and get the story out that way. And yeah, we've just done a bunch of things. One of the things that Pat Harding was really keen about is she wanted the story to get out there, and we realized there were multiple ways that we could get the story out there. The website, we wanted it to be a resource for community members, but also scholars, people who wanted to find that material. So we made a very kind of deep website there. But the cartoon, we also did, we did a 4-panel cartoon with Scott Chandler as well, to tell that story in four panels, and that was also really popular. And then, the mini comic and the baseball cards, and now this book, and Miriam Wright has also got a book coming out as well. So we really wanted to get the story out in multiple formats and multiple voices as far as we can.
Well, that does lead into our next question. The ways that you got it out into the community. At the beginning of the book, you mention that no one from the east end of Chatham, Ontario, which is the traditional Black neighborhood of that city, has ever forgotten about the Chatham Coloured All-Stars.
Mm-hmm.
Yet few people outside knew anything about them until recently, and you've been working on this project. Why do you suppose the story got lost or overlooked for so many years?
Oh, I'm looking at you, Irene. I think that, I think, it's kind of baffling to me in some ways. There's so many really great personalities. Flat Chase was this amazing hitter. He had a batting average of .470. He pitched, and he was just a great personality. And so whenever I present on them, people say, how do we not know about Flat Chase? And I'm like, I don't know. I really don't know. I think it's, and the other thing I think, actually, your question, Kim, is also really about why aren't there other stories like this that we know? And I think this is also tip of the iceberg. And I don't think the All-Stars are unique in not being known. There are lots of girls' baseball teams from the 30s and 40s that they mention. The Indigenous baseball, there needs to be books on that. And that's just, the Windsor, Essex, Chatham, Kent area that we're talking about. There's some Japanese baseball teams from mid 20th century that are going on. So I think that question is a really good one. And I think we need to all ask that. But I also think there are lots of other stories. And I hope that someone reading 1934 or hearing about the All-Stars might think, okay, what else is out there? What other stories haven't been heard and are missing? I think there's a lot out there. Sorry, I hope I didn't dance around your question, but.
So without giving too much of the plot away, because we want people to read the book, why should more people know about the Chatham Coloured All-Stars? Why are they important?
I think they're important because they toward the end, I talk about, this isn't just a sports story. This is a story of men who went out on an equal playing field and demanded respect and recognition and opportunity. And once they got that on the playing field, they were then able to ask for it off the field. And Blake Harding will tell you that doors did open slowly after the rest of Chatham started to see the talent of these men. And them demanding respect, I think, had a big impact on how the community saw them. And then someone like Dorothy Wright Wallace, who's the president of the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society, who is younger than the players, so she wouldn't have seen them, but she really lived in a different world because of them. And she said they were like movie stars. She says watching this team and seeing them, the community really felt like things were possible in ways that they hadn't seemed before. So yes, it's about baseball, but it's also about changing people's minds. Blake Harding talks about the team really changed the hearts and minds of Chatham. And I think that idea still carries on, even though it's, almost 100 years since they played, or 90. They still have a legacy. And I think people are really still inspired by men going out on an unequal playing field that should be equal and demanding respect and insisting on it. And toward the end of the book, I have I look at the 1935 season and then their final season as a team, 1939, to show that they did have a barrier breaking year. They did break barriers, but I'm very deliberate in saying that a barrier broken isn't necessarily a barrier dismantled. And so you start to see they did break barriers, but in 1935, their very next year, it was still very, all the stuff they felt in 1934 was still there, and probably a little bit more since they were the team to beat. And by the time, I don't want to give away too much, but by the time I get to 39, this is a team who's also willing to make a stand and say, this is unfair, and these are the reasons why. And I think in 1939, they were not willing to put up with things that they were earlier. And I think that's also an important part of this story. It's easy to look at this lovely arc of, this 1934 team. They came out of nowhere, which they didn't, and they won the championship, and then everything's great. But there's a lot of yes, but both before it and after. And so I don't want to give too much away. I mean, the major plot spoiler of 1934, everybody knows that they won, right? So we have to hold a couple of little plot secrets aside for that.
In your storytelling, you mentioned the scrapbooks, you looked at newspaper accounts and oral histories, but you also write very descriptively about Chatham, specifically the East End, and the sounds and sights people would have experienced in the neighborhood, or at least at a baseball game there, even the way the weather feels. This book really couldn't have been written in the same way by someone who hadn't spent a great deal of time in this region. But beyond living in Southwestern Ontario, what kind of research or preparation led to those lovely descriptive passages?
I think this is where, and thank you for that. That was a nice overview. I think this is where that fiction writing or the evocative, creative nonfiction part comes in. I wanted to get the history out there. This is what happened and various things, but I wanted people to be able to see these players and the team. And I think one of the things, it's interesting to have done a historical PhD, and I felt attached to my writers, but I didn't feel this deep commitment and affection and respect and a certain amount of awe with them. And I think it's because I met their families. And so these are real people, and they lived real and full lives. They weren't just men who played for a couple of years baseball. They led long lives and had an impact on their children and their grandchildren and their communities. And I wanted that to come across, and that's not you're not allowed to do that in scholarly writing. And I wanted this book to be scholarly in its methodologies. It's meticulously and detailed in its documentation. So I wanted scholars to be able to find absolutely everything that I had found. And if they want to trace anything, it's all there. But I wanted to also make it alive. I wanted the people and the families and the place to seem more than just an academic setting or characters in a larger historical event. So I did want to spend a fair bit of time on that description and try to capture Chatham. And I did spend a lot of time just wandering around, looking at houses and sitting in the ballpark and just by myself imagining what it's like. I did that a couple weeks ago, and just sort of let the place speak. And also I also wanted the the players and the families to speak for themselves as well. And that's why there's an awful lot of large blocks of quotes, and their words were really how I used the baseball season as sort of the main organizing piece, but then I put, their voices and their experiences in where it fit. And then I sort of built around those. So I can't remember what your original question was, but I hope I answered it.
Yes, you did. Yeah, because, in scholarly work, there's sometimes a limit on how much you can quote. And it's nice that you gave yourself permission to just quote as much as you needed to in this particular work.
Yeah. And I wanted the personalities to come through. There was one section, and bless him, Dan's like, this doesn't add anything. I'm like, but I love it. I love it. And it captures this person and it captures their impact. And yeah, I will take your advice on many, many, many things, but I really want to keep these few lines that maybe didn't add to the larger narrative, but they added to who this son was and how he saw his father, and how that affected him as a father and grandfather as well.
Speaking of the families and their contributions to the book, what do you think those contributions added to the narrative? And how have those families been reacting to the book?
I haven't actually talked to them since I read it. Blake and Pat they got an advanced reading copy, and I think they started reading it, and they were just Pat's phrase is over the moon. She's over the moon about everything this project has done. And, but to me, the families are the biggest part of this book, and I wanted to try to honor their trust in me and the respect that I have for all of them in this book. And so I have a part toward the end that I sort of, I don't know, I forget about it, and then I'm flipping through, I'm like, oh yeah, that's part of it. And the part where I talk about realizing how much love the descendants have for their family members and their missing fathers, and the amount of lingering grief that there is still there. I mean, some of these people lost their parents 20, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and that grief is still very real. And I always realize that grief and love are so interconnected. The amount of grief you feel is revealing of how much love you feel. And I wanted that love to come through. I wanted people to remember these were complex human beings with relationships and legacies far beyond the baseball field. And so I wanted to make sure that they were, to use a fiction term, well-rounded characters, and I wanted to convey that. So I hope the family sees the love and respect that I have had for them and their family members. So it'll be interesting to talk to them, but I know there a number of them are just really excited to hear their fathers and uncles' stories being preserved, and saving a bit of those memories for future generations as well.
This book has been released at a time when many important and courageous conversations about race and equity and inclusion are taking place in our society, of course. In light of that reality, what do you most hope that readers will take away from this book?
I think I'm hoping that they will see there is missing history all over the place, that this is not a one and done thing, like, oh, well, we've finished with, Black baseball in this region. Like, no, there is way, way more in this narrative. I think I begin the book with talking about how many times I had taken the train through Chatham and gone right by this ballpark. I mean, hundreds of times, and I never noticed it. And then realizing that this history was there the whole time, and I went right by, and I was totally blind. And now when I go through, I can't not see it. And I think thinking about history is also very much like that. What is right in front of us that we don't see? What are the missing stories? What scrapbooks do other people have about their families? What has been preserved? What hasn't been preserved? So I'm hoping this will be an invitation for other people to not only learn about the All-Stars, but feel inspired to seek out stories in their own families and their own neighborhoods and communities and things that need to get told. I don't think this is the only book, and with Miriam's, those aren't the only two books that will or should be written about this team or about baseball in this region. There's a lot more. And so I'm hoping some people will pick up some of those little threads that we've left out there, and they'll find some more. So I'm hoping this will be the beginning of conversations, not just sort of the definitive book, which it is not. It's capturing one aspect. There's a lot more. Dorothy Wright Wallace, who I adore, she always says to me, "Now, Heidi, what about the girls? What are you going to write about the girls?" And I did. Sorry, Dorothy, they kind of got edited out, but that is another huge history as well. Boomer Harding's sisters were also athletes and led very, very interesting lives, as you know, from Beulah Cousins. And so I'm hoping that someone will pick up Dorothy's comment about what about the girls? What about them?
Would you like to read from some of your work for our audience?
Sure, I can do that. I always like to start at the beginning, and not because of Julie Andrews. It is a very good place to start, but I'm going to skip a little bit. I've got an introduction and a preface, but I'm going to start with, this is some of the scene setting for 1934. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the 1934 season and go from there. Last May, I walked around the east end of Chatham, down Wellington Street, across Princess Street, along Park Street, towards Skane Street. Even with directions to Skane Street, it's easy to miss the wooden sign for Sterling Park and the small playground with a thin stand of trees. If you do see the sign and you walk through the trees, you'll find yourself on a fairly ordinary-looking ball diamond. Rough green grass, a chain-link backstop and fences, and a red clay infield. On this day, I was alone there. The silence of the park was punctuated only by the sounds of crows and red-winged blackbirds and a distant train whistle. But on the evening of May 17th, 1934, most of the neighborhood, easily a few hundred people, would have been filing into Sterling Park, milling about, catching up with neighbors, grateful for the lengthening days and the still new green of the trees. Tonight's home game was opening day, the first in what would be the Chatham Coloured All-Stars barrier-breaking season. It isn't hard to imagine what the East End looked like in May 1934. The trees were undoubtedly smaller, but Sterling's variety is still on the corner of Park and St. George Streets. And some of the 1- and 2-story houses that line the East End streets have newer aluminum siding and small additions built on. Others have fresh coats of paint on the clapboard, but they look like the houses captured in snapshots in the players' family photo albums. Most of the houses have stoops or porches, and it's easy to imagine families sitting there on May 17th, 1934, shouting out to neighbors walking down the sidewalk, sharing laughs and maybe some chatter about the upcoming baseball season. Some might have predicted that the Stars would beat the RG Duns that night. Others might have even predicted that the Stars would have a stellar season. But few could have predicted how far the All-Stars would go that year. Most people on their way to the park that night were probably excited and relieved that it was opening day, baseball's annual reminder that winter has passed, and within weeks, a cool spring would melt into a warm summer. I'm just going to skip a little bit here, and I talk about where the players lived and imagine them walking to the game. While the streets look about the same as they might have in 1934, you can still find many of the players' houses. Sterling Park has undergone significant changes. Today, it looks little like it did in 1934, and in addition to the baseball diamond, there was also a wading pool and a swimming pool separated by a walkway, and on the south end of the park alongside the train tracks where the ball diamond is now. Images from the 1930s show this park as lively, the pools packed with both black and white children. And just beside the pools, towards Park Street, there were bleachers facing the ball diamond and dugouts on the east and west sides of the park. A scoreboard, now long gone, was parallel to Park Street, and a playground with swings and teeter-totters sat beside the grandstand. Given the proximity of the ballpark, residents of houses along Park Street likely found baseballs in their yards and gardens in summer months, or, as happened to one family, in their kitchens. A clipping from the Chatham Daily News recounts, Leo Boulanger's backyard is adjacent to Sterling Park. Last evening, while Leo and his family were eating supper, some of the Duns were practicing in the park. A ball came in through the open window of the Boulanger domicile, landed in a dish of corn on the table, and bounded into the sink and broke some dishes. And when I stood at home plate surveying the barely green grass, it wasn't hard to believe that a ball flew into a kitchen, or to imagine the chatter of adults, the joyous splashing of children in the pool, the crack of a bat on that Thursday evening in May 1934, when the All-Stars took on the RG Duns. So I always love that ball in the can of corn, or the bowl of corn.
That is a Southwestern Ontario story, if ever there was one. Oh, well, the new book published by Biblioasis is 1934, The Chatham Coloured All-Stars, Barrier-Breaking Year. Thank you so much for joining us, Heidi L.M. Jacobs.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the show. It's really great to be on it. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.